đồng bào cả nước. Tất cả mọi người đều sinh ra có quyền bình đẳng, tạo hóa cho họ những quyền không ai có thể xâm phạm được. Trong những quyền ấy có quyền được sống, quyền tự do và quyền mưu cầu hạnh phúc.
The end of the American War. On April 30th, 1975, the last of America's wartime personnel in South Vietnam boarded crowded boats and helicopters in a frantic attempt to flee the country. That same day, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The palace was the seat of the South Vietnamese government, which the Americans had supported, and the North Vietnamese had fought against. When North Vietnamese officers entered the palace, South Vietnam's president told them he was ready to hand over power. They reportedly replied, "You cannot give up what you do not have." The Vietnam War, or what is known in Vietnam as the Resistance War against the Americans, was over. The war's toll was immense. The country's infrastructure was ravaged by bombing and landmines, and parts of its otherwise lush landscape had been stripped by toxic chemicals like Agent Orange. As many as 2 million civilians died in the conflict, along with 1.3 million Vietnamese soldiers. Most of these soldiers died fighting for or alongside North Vietnam. But for all the losses North Vietnam had to absorb, its government and its allies in the South had reason to feel triumphant. They had prevailed against all odds, says historian Christopher Goska, first beating the French in a violent war of decolonization, then beating the Americans in one of the most brutal conflicts of the Cold War. The challenges of reconciliation. Civil wars result from, and sometimes deepen, divisions within societies. As Goska observes, those divisions do not simply disappear once the fighting stops, for this was the case in Vietnam. Although some people in South Vietnam welcomed reunification and liberation, not everyone shared the feeling of triumph. The fall of Saigon in 1975 paved the way for the long-awaited reunification of Vietnam. But reconciliation, healing the wounds and divisions of a society in the aftermath of sustained violence, was a bigger challenge. One thing standing in the way of reconciliation was the North Vietnamese government's deep suspicion of many people in the South and their doubts about Southerners' loyalty to the communist regime. The story of Vietnam after the war can be told from many different perspectives. Here, we focus on one of those perspectives, that of the Southerners who were made to feel that their lives before 1975 were a crime that needed to be punished, or a sin for which they needed to atone. We look at how they responded to life under a new system. Some adapted, some found safe ways to resist, and some decided that their best or only hope was to leave to make a new life elsewhere. We also look at the dramatic changes that have taken place in Vietnam since economic reforms were introduced in 1986. Changes that, according to recent surveys, have made Vietnam one of the most optimistic societies in the world. The road to war and partition. In May 1975, the North Vietnamese government faced the daunting task of stitching back together a country torn apart by decades of war. This rupture had its roots in the period of French colonization, 1858 to 1954, a bitter experience for the vast majority of Vietnamese that gave rise to various pro-independence movements. The most significant of these was the Indochinese Communist Party created by nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh in 1930. During the Second World War, the Japanese occupied Indochina, but kept the French in place to administer Vietnam. Meanwhile, in 1941, Ho Chi Minh secretly created the Vietnamese Independence League, called the Viet Minh, but did not have an opportunity to seize power until 1945. In March of that year, the Japanese overthrew the French in Indochina, but then surrendered to the Allies 5 months later. The surrender created a power vacuum that allowed the Viet Minh to seize power in the northern city of Hanoi. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared the country's independence, naming it the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. France, however, was not willing to give up its profitable colony. From 1946 to 1954, it fought the Viet Minh in a conflict now referred to as the First Indochina War. At first, the French had the upper hand, but the Viet Minh wore them down, dealing them a decisive blow in 1954 in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Shortly after that, the world's major powers opened negotiations in Geneva, Switzerland, to try to bring an end to the war. There were two outcomes of the Geneva Conference. First, a ceasefire ended the war between France and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. However, this also resulted in the country being divided at its waist, the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam took control of the zone to the north of the 17th parallel, while the state of Vietnam, created by the French in 1949 and increasingly supported by the Americans, administered the south. The second outcome was an agreement by the two Vietnams to hold elections in 1956. These elections, it was believed, would unite the country under one of the two governments. Ho Chi Minh was heavily favored. But this was not to be. In 1955, an anti-communist nationalist in the South named Ngo Dinh Diem transformed the state of Vietnam into the Republic of Vietnam and opposed unification with the Communist North. The existence of two Vietnams was now more entrenched, a communist North Vietnam and an authoritarian non-communist South Vietnam. By 1960, a civil war was brewing, especially after the North created the National Liberation Front, a political organization and army, better known as the Viet Cong, in the South. The NLF included both communists and non-communists, and its purpose was to bring down the Ngo Dinh Diem government and unify the country on the North's terms. As the Viet Cong expanded its control over the South, the U.S. responded by sending more military advisors. Worried that Ngo Dinh Diem was failing to stop the communists from taking over, U.S. President John F. Kennedy supported the South Vietnamese military's overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963. Neither Diem nor Kennedy would survive the year. Diem was assassinated by his own military on November 2, 1963, and Kennedy was killed in Dallas 3 weeks later. Following Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson became the new U.S. president. In 1965, the United States intervened directly in Vietnam by sending troops to South Vietnam. The Second Indochina War, also known as the American War, had begun, would not end until the United States withdrew and South Vietnam fell to the communist-run Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1975. Building a socialist economy. In addition to consolidating political control, the Vietnamese government introduced a socialist, centrally planned economy in the South. This system was already in place in the North. In such economies, people are often discouraged or forbidden from owning private property. Instead, property is collectively owned and controlled by the government, which makes decisions about what to produce and how much to distribute to different groups. Introducing this system in the South led the government to take several actions. Cracking down on capitalism, the government confiscated or took away private property from its owners and nationalized or took control of many Southern businesses. One of the groups most affected was the ethnic Chinese minority, known as the Hoa. Many Hoa in the South profited during the period of French colonization and continued to play a major role in South Vietnam's capitalist economy. However, they generally avoided politics and refrained from aligning themselves too closely with the South Vietnamese government. Nevertheless, by the late 1970s, two events made the Hoa a target: failing economic policies, which made them a convenient scapegoat, and the Vietnam government's deteriorating relationship with China. Deurbanizing the population. The population of cities like Saigon swelled in size during the war as people fled the fighting and bombing in rural areas. After reunification, the government worried these cities would become sites of social unrest, and it encouraged people to return to their hometowns. Some did so voluntarily, but others were relocated against their will to new economic zones set up by the government. These zones were usually located in remote highland areas, where living conditions were harsh. Many people escaped or bribed their way back to the city, and the new economic zones came to be widely perceived as places of internal exile. In addition, many of the highland areas where NEZs were set up were inhabited by Vietnam's indigenous peoples, and they generally did not welcome outsiders who viewed them as backwards and uneducated. Collectivizing peasants. About half of all rural families in the South were organized into agricultural collectives. These collectives put several families together into a single unit that was expected to combine what they produced and turn over any surplus to the government. The government distributed this surplus to people elsewhere in the country. In collectivized farming, people were rarely rewarded individually for their hard work. Thus, while collectives were supposed to make the rural economy more productive, they often had the opposite effect. Says Christopher Goska, collectivizing agriculture and setting uncompetitive prices erased incentives for production in the countryside. By the late 1970s, Vietnam, once a major rice producer, was experiencing cases of famine or near famine. It was becoming clear that the socialist economic experiment in the South was failing. Putting post-war Vietnam in context. For any country recovering from years of civil war, stabilizing and rebuilding can be overwhelming. Vietnam's ability to do this was slowed by two additional challenges. The first was economic. After withdrawing from the country in 1975, the United States imposed a trade embargo on Vietnam, cutting off the war-wrecked country not only from U.S. exports and imports, but also from those of other nations that bowed to American pressure. In addition, the United States pressured other international bodies to deny assistance to Vietnam. The second challenge was geopolitical. 2 weeks before Vietnam's reunification, the government in neighboring Cambodia was overthrown by the Khmer Rouge, a communist regime often described as genocidal and murderous. The Khmer Rouge began launching attacks against Vietnam along their shared border. In 1977, Vietnam retaliated with military strikes of its own, and by late 1978, began a more vigorous assault on the Khmer Rouge. In January 1979, it overthrew the Khmer Rouge and replaced it with a government that was more favorable toward Vietnam. Later that year, China, as punishment for the overthrow of its ally, the Khmer Rouge, launched a brief attack on several northern provinces on Vietnam. These two conflicts were part of a larger group of conflicts known as the Third Indochina War. Nevertheless, pointing the finger at these other governments did not help Vietnam solve the practical economic difficulties it was facing internally. Following reformist policies being adopted in China and the Soviet Union, Vietnam's communists launched market-oriented economic reforms that set the country on a course for major changes. As noted earlier, the wounds inflicted during civil wars take a long time to heal. Has Vietnam healed those wounds and finally achieved reconciliation between Northerners and Southerners? The optimism Vietnamese people feel about their future suggests that the war may not be the most important issue for a majority of the country's people. Indeed, the survey mentioned above suggests a country that is looking ahead more than it is looking to the past. When Barack Obama visited the country in 2016, the U.S. president's comments reflected this mood as he spoke to a crowd in the capital city of Hanoi. "This is your moment," he said, assuring them that as they pursued the future they wanted, the United States, the country that fought Vietnam for more than 2 decades, would be right there along with them. But on the issue of the war, there are still lingering differences between northern and southern perspectives. For older Vietnamese, the war and its aftermath are emotional topics remembered and recounted with selective detail. Southerners, for example, tend to be familiar with and sympathetic to the perilous, often tragic experience of the boat refugees, an exodus in which, by some estimates, as many as 300,000 people perished at sea. Northerners, on the other hand, sometimes show only a vague awareness and express a harsh viewpoint, some calling those who left cowards who abandoned Vietnam in hard times. What do younger Vietnamese think? The answer to this question is significant. Almost 70% of the country's population was born after the war, and their memories of that period of the country's history are mostly inherited from their parents and grandparents, or learned through what they are taught in school. In fact, the post-war generation is the first generation since French colonialism to have been raised during a time of independence and peace. Many urban youth tell international reporters that they are not that interested in learning about the war, and would prefer to spend their time doing the kinds of things that young people in other countries like doing, such as riding skateboards, shopping with friends, hanging out in cafes, and making plans for where they will study abroad. All things that are available to them thanks to the economic reforms and opening up afforded by Doi Moi. These benefits, however, often feel out of reach for many rural youth. While the reforms that have been underway since 1986 have generally benefited Vietnam as a whole, it is clearly the case that urban, well-connected families have benefited much more. How did Vietnam's economy transform after the liberation? According to the General Statistics Office, Vietnam's economy in the early years of the interpretation was low, and in fact there was no development. The economy has no internal savings because of not having enough food. The national income for production is only equal to 80 to 90% of the demand for use. This period of hyperinflation raged. During the period 1976 to 1985, the retail price index of goods in the following year always increased at double digits and fluctuated at 19 to 92%. In 1986, inflation peaked with an increase in prices of 774.7%. People's lives are very difficult and lacking. After the decision to reform and open the door in 1986, the economy gradually recovered and had certain development steps. The country went from a constant lack of food. In 1988, our country had to import more than 450,000 tons of rice. By 1990, it rose to meet the domestic demand, with reserves and exports exceeding 1987 more than 2 million tons, and in 1989 reached 21.4 million tons. In the period 1976 to 1980, on average a year, the total social product increased only 1.4%, the national income increased by 0.4%. Then after the innovation, Vietnam's GDP always grew significantly with 7 to 8% year. In the 1986 to 1990 period, GDP grew at an average of 4.4% year. In the period 1991 to 1995, the average GDP of the whole country increased by 8.2% year. In the 1996 to 2000 period, the GDP growth rate reached 7%. Plus on average, from 1991 to 2000, GDP increased by 7.6% year. In the period 2001 to 2010, GDP increased by 7.26% year on average. In the period 2011 to 2015, it will reach about 6% year. Plus for the whole period, the average GDP growth rate is nearly 7%, of which the GDP has increased by 7.43% for 20 consecutive years. Economic restructuring. In the first years after the liberation, the economy operated under the subsidy mechanism, so it was not clear. At that time, agriculture still accounted for a high proportion of the production. Entering the renovation period, the economic structure of Vietnam began to shift in all three fields. In 1986, agriculture still accounted for the highest proportion, with 38.1%. The proportion of the service sector is 33%, while the industry has the lowest one with 28.9%. The economy still depends heavily on agriculture, solving shortages of wages and job security for tens of millions of people. 2. The industry develops mainly in the fields of mining, electricity, paper. From the renovation until now, the economic structure has changed rapidly. The service sector rose to become the industry with the highest proportion of GDP, with 40.1%, and industry, with 32.7%. The agriculture sector only contributes 10% of the country's GDP. There's also a big change in the industry. From mining, paper production, mechanical engineering is mainly now moving to new industries such as processing industry, textile, consumer goods production, electronics and telecommunications, chemicals. The industrial and service sectors always have strong double-digit growth, which is the driving force for structural change, shifting towards industrialization and modernization. The magnet to attract foreign investment. Entering the Doi Moi period, Vietnam opened the door and developed policies to attract foreign investment capital, FDI. It must be said that FDI has contributed greatly to the growth of Vietnam. FDI is both the driving force for growth, while helping Vietnam implement the orientation of industrialization, creating jobs for millions of workers, and contributing greatly to the export value. After the efforts of the heroes, they stood up to protect and build Vietnam as it is today. The Vietnamese government and all people are trying to strive for and develop the country stronger in the coming time. Hopefully, Vietnam will have new steps in the future. Thank you for watching the video, and see you next time in the video. If you like the video, please like the video to support us. If this is your first time visit us, please subscribe to Ask Kpop Entertainment to discover more interesting videos. See you again.